What is going on? AP US History, Mr. Majewski here. We're going to talk about the first 1/3 of the mass democracy notes. These are large notes. These are probably the most important notes of the three of this unit. This is going to tell us all about Andrew Jackson. So let's get right into it. We start with the rise of mass democracy. You're going to watch this part of the video today in class for about 25 minutes. Then you're going to watch another 20 to 25 minute video over the weekend. And then we'll finish these notes up in class on Tuesday. So let's get started. Again, the rise of mass democracy. What is that? Well, in the 1820s, there's a new spirit of popular democracy that sweeps across the nation. What we mean here is way more people than ever before are going to be involved in voting. We're going to make it easier to vote. We're going to have many, many more people who are a part of the political process who are actually voting. And that means we have new candidates that kind of more represent common people than ever before. The most famous is Andrew Jackson. And he's really responsible for a lot of this. So by the 1820s, something called new or mass democracy has emerged. Politicians increasingly began to appeal to the masses. Now, this probably started with Thomas Jefferson in the 1800s, but he was wealthy. And he believed that the wealthy Jeffersonian Republicans should make decisions on behalf of the masses. Now we're going to actually start to see politicians appeal to them by acting more like a common person in order to get votes for themselves. So, like I said, Jeffersonians believed in government for the people. Jacksonians were more about government by the people. So now we're going to have more middle class and common era people who are going to start to become involved in politics for the first time. It takes a lot of forms. The big reason here is because in many states, all men are now able to vote for the first time by the 1820s. You don't have to own land anymore. So now politicians have to appeal to the lower and the middle classes more than ever before because so many of them are able to vote for the first time. And again, Andrew Jackson is really the first one to tap into this and to take advantage of this. And other politicians that follow after him began to copy his model. All right. So let's get right to it. And of course, there's another reason as well. Labor unions start to form. Originally, they were called working men's parties. When these labor unions form, representing workers, politicians had to start to appeal to them. So you have Jackson, who's a guy from out west, who really appeals to Westerners and lower class Americans, especially since he's a war hero, right? And he kind of came from very little, and he raised himself up into a very wealthy person. A lot of folks respected that. And then you have these unions in the East, in big cities that are starting to form. And so many politicians appeal to them as well, including Jackson. These unions are fighting for free education for their children. They're fighting for maximum work hours. They want to end debtors' prisons. And so together, politicians had to appeal now to these new people out west and to these labor unions in the east. Why did mass or new democracy take place? Well, one of them had to do with the Panic of 1819. We already covered that. Remember, it was a panic that occurred especially out west, and a lot of workers and farmers blamed the banks, what they called the Eastern Establishment, especially the Bank of the United States, for causing the panic. And a lot of these lower class workers and farmers decided, you know what, we need to get involved in politics now if we're ever going to change this system. So they were so outraged by the panic that many of them, for the first time, become involved in politics to try to fix it. And that means they're going to start voting more, and they're going to try to find candidates that they think better represent them. In addition to that, the Missouri Compromise. There was a lot of anger and frustration with the compromise on both sides. North didn't really want to compromise. South didn't want to compromise. Ultimately, that's what happens. And so a lot of voters on both sides were a little frustrated with that and said, you know what, maybe we should try to vote some people in that represent us. So that we do not have to settle for these compromises that we do not support any longer. Anyways, we start a new political age after the era of good feelings. It really begins in 1824. We're going to start to see two parties form again. We're still going to have those Republicans that had originally been Jeffersonians, right, that are going to be around. But now we're going to develop a new group known as the Jacksonian Democrats. We're going to see massive voter turnout, more so than we've ever seen before. Millions more Americans are going to get out and vote than they had previously. We're going to start to see a new style of politicking. Politicians now are going to appeal to the common people. So they're going to get out and actively campaign. They're going to go around and try to convince people for their votes. There's going to be a lot more like rallies and politicians who are traveling all around to try to shake hands, right? To try to talk to people, to try to get their votes. That hadn't really happened before. Jefferson and those guys, they didn't go around campaigning. They didn't really feel like they needed to. Now, because so many more people are involved in voting than ever before, politicians have to get out there, introduce themselves, and really convince these lower-class Americans that their votes were needed. Voting reform takes place, so millions more Americans are able to vote than they had previously. Oftentimes this meant that land was no longer required for you to be able to vote. All right? There's not only just the election do we see more people voting, but even nomination as well. Nominating your party's candidate became much more democratic. We start to use something called the convention to decide who the candidate's going to be from each party. So the Democrats will have a convention, the Republicans will have a convention. Previously, they had used something called a caucus, where just a handful of people made the decision who would run for president for their party. Now, the conventions have thousands of people, and so politicians have to appeal to it. This is the big one right here. Look at this graph that is being displayed up on the screen. This is the percentage of eligible voters who did vote. So if you look at 1824 here, you're going to notice only about 25% of people who technically were eligible to vote did. By 1840, that's up to 80%, right? So we're seeing massive increases in the number of people who are coming out on election day and actually casting a ballot. 80% is absurd. We get nowhere near that today. As a result of these changes, where they made it easier for people to vote, suddenly we have, 2 and 3 times the number of people that are voting in elections. And so politicians have to appeal to all of these millions of people who suddenly have the right to vote for the first time. And so they change how they campaign, they change how politics was done. Here's a great example of that. This is a famous painting that was done. And you see how campaigning now is almost like a party atmosphere. You almost would have a picnic or a party, and you would get up there and you would speak in front of it. You're trying to get people to get out there and to support you. You'll notice there's alcohol that's being served, right? You'll notice it's almost like a family atmosphere where you have kids that are hanging around as well. Now it's mostly it's men that are voting, right? So you see it's male dominant. But you see it's not like the old way of doing things where the candidate might just go and talk to the wealthy folks in town. Now you got to get out there, you got to shake hands, you got to kiss babies, you got to do all these things to convince the folks, hey, I'm your guy, I'm just like you. And if you want to elect somebody who's going to go and represent you, you got to vote for me. All right, it's as simple as that. I love this guy who's like totally passed out. This guy's struggling over here as well. So again, they're signing people up to vote. On the spot, right? They're kind of giving them food and drink to make it seem like they're the best choice for the common person. All of this is brand new and a new style of voting. Here you see it again. This is called the stump speech. Here you see this politician, and he's actually now giving speeches to the masses. He's encouraged them to come out, right? He is giving speeches. And what he's trying to do here is he's just trying to convince folks, hey, I'm the best candidate for the job because I'm going to represent the common people's interests, right? So again, you'll notice you have a lot of folks who normally wouldn't be involved in politics that are out here listening to the speeches, and it's really trying to convince folks, hey, I'm the most like you, and so you can support me because I'm going to represent your interests in Washington when I get over there. All of this is such a new style of politicking and campaigning. And politicians had to be way more active and almost prove to the masses that they were a common person and they would represent common people's interests. All right? Here's a close-up of the same image. I'm not totally sure why. I'm not sure what's going on there either, but, well. Anyways, here's another one. This is called country politician. A lot of the times these politicians were trying to sign people up to vote. This is like in the back room making a deal with somebody in order to get their vote. Hey, if you vote for me, I will make sure that, you know, a new school or a new train station gets built in your city or your town. And so it was a lot of one-on-one politicking, where politicians are going to start to make deals in order to get votes and to really convince people, hey, this is why you should vote for me. So a lot of political favors are going to start to go on here. I would argue things start to get a little bit more corrupt for the first time because politicians are willing to do almost anything and say almost anything in order to get votes. Then again, these folks are really appealing to the masses. Now, why did all of this start? Well, I mentioned there were changes to voting, right? And we have to go now to the election of 1824. This is the election that ends the era of good feelings, and this is a really important election in American history, and here's why. There's only one party at this time. We only have one party in the country during the era of good feelings. So all four of these guys that are running are technically all members of the same political party, the Democratic Republicans. And when you see the results there on election day, that was the popular vote right there. Andrew Jackson, the war hero from the War of 1812, is your winner. Now, each of these four candidates represented a different region of the country. Jackson represented the West, and especially the Southwest. John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, represented the Northeast, New England. William Crawford represented the South, and Henry Clay, he represented the West. He was from Kentucky. So each of them represented a different region of the country, even though they were all kind of different political parties, even though they were all part of the same political party. And so you look at that result, and there's no clear winner, right? Nobody's close to 50%. And so when nobody gets a majority of the electoral votes, that means the House of Representatives votes and decides who the winner is going to be. So the way that it worked was, because Clay finished in fourth place, and by the way, that's the first time he runs for president and loses, he has to drop out. So it's between the other three candidates. All right. Now, if you look here, look at how divided the country is. Look at how divided these votes are. Jackson gets a lot of his votes from the South and the West, right? Clay gets a handful of votes out West, all right? Quincy Adams is strong up in Northeast, and then Crawford just picks certain states in the South, picks apart certain states in the South, and is able to get votes from them. But that's a divided election, no clear winner. And so again, it's up to the House of Representatives to decide who's going to win this thing. Well, you would figure it's probably going to be Jackson, right? But when Clay drops out, suddenly he's in a unique position. He's the Speaker of the House, and the House decides the election. And so even though that was the outcome of the election, Jackson earned the popular vote, but he didn't earn enough of the electoral votes to win. And so Clay, the Speaker of the House, who hates Jackson, he disliked him. He considered him a rival. They were both Westerners. Jackson has a reputation for being kind of hard to deal with. And so he decides to support John Quincy Adams. And he gets his people that voted for him in the House, and he says, hey, let's vote for John Quincy Adams instead. What happens when the House votes then is John Quincy Adams wins. Even though he had finished second in the election, even though he finished second in the voting by the people, he ends up becoming president because Henry Clay and his supporters throw their support behind him. Well, as you might imagine, Jackson was bothered by this, and he was especially bothered by this because a few days after Adams won the election, he turned around and he made Henry Clay his Secretary of State. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, right? These sorts of deals can technically take place. However, Jacksonians were outraged, and they called this a corrupt bargain. Clay and Adams have made this backroom deal. They've denied us the presidency. They've denied the people their say because the people, Jacksonians claim, wanted Andrew Jackson. That's why he won the majority vote. And so they're outraged by this, and they make a huge deal about it. And what they end up doing is going out to the public and really exposing this as some sort of corrupt bargain or corrupt deal. And as a result of that, hundreds of thousands of Americans are so outraged by it that, again, this is another reason why they decide to get into politics and they start voting more than ever before so that corrupt bargains like this won't happen in the future. Well, That's what happens in 1824. And so technically your next president of the United States after James Monroe is John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams. So you'll notice Quincy Adams is a one-termer. And you'll notice he falls right in the middle there in terms of popularity. He's number 19. And so obviously he's not going to be as successful, and he's not going to be able to get that second term like some of the presidents that came before him. So that's the background, all right? And suddenly Andrew Jackson, who was his war hero and who campaigned for president, basically after the 1824 election, he begins to campaign almost immediately for 1828. And he really starts, going around, and he and his supporters make a huge deal out of this corrupt bargain. And as a result of that, really whip a lot of the public into a frenzy to get them out to vote in 1828 so that that won't happen again. So that's another reason why we see this new democracy. All right, another major issue or reason why people begin to become more involved in politics than ever before and start voting more than ever before is the tariff. Now remember, the tariff is an issue that really divides the country. Generally, Northerners supported it because it helped industry. Generally, Southerners opposed it, right, because it hurts agriculture in their mind, and it results in tariffs against us. Well, Congress during this time was controlled by Northerners, and so they continually increased the tariff. In 1824, they increased it from 23 to 37%, which means tax on foreign goods is now going to be at a whopping 37% of the value of the price of the good. That's high. Remember, back in 1792, it was 8%, right? In 1816, when we passed our first protective tariff, it was only like 16%. Now it's all the way up to 37%, which is a huge amount to tax foreign goods. Jacksonians actually saw it as an opportunity. These people who supported Jackson saw maybe if we continually raise it and the people oppose it, maybe it'll make President Adams, who's technically the president at this time, make him look bad. And the people will begin to oppose him, and it'll make it easier for us to become elected in 1828. So Jacksonians kind of tried to continually raise the tariff in these 4 years in order to get Adams to take the blame for it, I guess you could say, since he was president. So a new tariff was passed in 1828. And it massively increased the percent to an even higher amount, above 37%, up to above 40% was the tax now. Northerners supported it because they wanted the tariff as high as possible. Southerners opposed it, including the vice president at the time, John C. Calhoun, who basically argued the tariff is unfair, it's hurting us in the South. Southerners really opposed the tariff, as you might expect. They usually did. They did not want to have to pay it, one, because when they exported their crops, they were going to get hit with tariffs from other countries. Secondly, when you pass tariffs, companies have to raise their prices, and so goods tend to go up. The price of goods goes up, so you have to pay more than you did before for goods. The vice president actually wrote a protest against the tariff called the South Carolina Exposition. Now, he wrote it under a ghost name, so nobody knew it was actually the vice president that was writing it at the time. But he basically explained in it, hey, the tariff's unfair, it's unconstitutional. States should nullify it. If you remember, that was the same argument that Jefferson and Madison used when they argued that the Alien and Sedition Act should be repealed, that the states should nullify it and get rid of the law if the federal government was not going to do so. All right? It didn't work. They didn't have enough support to get it nullified. So this tariff ends up getting passed. All right? So again, this is all part of the Jacksonians' plan. Even though they're Southerners, even though they're Westerners, they wanted this tariff raised as high as possible, because they thought it would make the president, who was in charge at the time, look bad, especially in the South, and then they could take advantage and get elected in 1828. Well, speaking of 1828, there was a massive rematch between Quincy Adams and Jackson. Now, the Democratic-Republican Party broke into two halves, right? And that's why the era of good feeling ends, because we go back to two parties again. Those who remained in the Democratic Republicans changed their name. They started calling themselves National Republicans, and they supported the president, John Quincy Adams. They were mostly Northerners. It was a dirty campaign. Both sides really smeared each other tremendously. For instance, they accused Jackson's wife of bigamy, which means being married to two people at the same time. Apparently she had been married previously, and there were questions as to whether she had officially gotten the divorce before she married Jackson. Democrats, of course, supported Jackson, the war hero. Jackson was, kind of an interesting guy. He was not a politician. He had grown up out west. He was known as being kind of crass. He cussed a lot. He, threatened, he would get into fights. Well, not when he was president, but earlier in his life. He was not a traditional politician. He was not refined. He was kind of rough around the edges. And that appealed to common people a lot. He spoke his mind all the time. He was just not your traditional politician. He was not polished. He was very kind of crude and wanted things his way all the time. Anyways, you've got this really, really nasty election that goes on. People's wives are being brought into it. There is Rachel Robards Jackson, who was accused of being a bigamist by the Quincy Adams people. So now the families are getting involved in it. Here's a campaign poster, right, where they're talking about, hey, you got to appeal to the masses now. So you look at the messages being spoken here, right? Jackson forever, the hero of two wars, the man of the people, right? Power should be derived from the people, right? His nickname was Old Hickory, all right, because they said when he fought in wars, he never retreated. He was like an old hickory tree. He just planted roots and refused to retreat. So you see what they're doing here. They're trying to really appeal to the masses here by making Jackson seem like a man of the people, like a self-made man. You'll notice here it says, he who could not barter nor bargain for the presidency, talking about Jackson. That's a shot at Adams, right, for the supposed corrupt bargain that he had been a part of. So again, got to appeal to those masses in this new style of campaigning, in this new politics, and that's what Jackson does. He's able to beat Adams convincingly in 1828, so he reverses the 1824 election. He becomes the first president from a western state in American history. He was very much seen as a common man, even though he was wealthy and he owned a plantation. His support came from all over, not just out west, not just with the farmers and the frontier people out west, but also labor unions and immigrants in the east as well. He called it a revolution of 1828, just like Jefferson had called the revolution of 1800. There was massive voter turnout, much more than ever before, and that really propelled him to the victory. All of these new voters, overwhelmingly, first-time voters, tended to vote for him because they considered him to be very much like themselves, and they considered Adams to be, wealthy, refined, kind of a elitist, kind of an aristocrat, I guess you could say. And they wanted a guy that they thought better represented them. By electing a man who from the West, we're starting to see that political power is shifting. No longer does the East Coast have all of the political power. Now you're starting to see, as more people moved west, as we expanded westward, suddenly political power is moving with it because more people are being represented by western states. Anyways, Jackson is your next president, all right, and that is, look at that map, right? Look at how big he wins. Remember in 1824 how divided it was between the four candidates? Well, now that Jackson has taken advantage of this new style of campaigning, he's able to travel around the country and really get votes, not only out west, but all over the South. Quincy Adams is only really able to retain most of New England, and so it's a landslide for Jackson against Adams. It's a reversal of 1824. Andrew Jackson is your new president. There is his picture. He is a Jacksonian Democrat, a member of a new political party. If you ask me, he looks kind of like a vampire in that picture, but hey, whatever. And as you can see, he's 13th here, so he's in the first column, which means he's known as a influential and successful presidential candidate. Jackson personifies this new democracy. He personified the West, especially. He's going to rule, he says, or preside on behalf of the common people. He's very suspicious of the federal government, as many Westerners were, as many farmers were, and even as many Southerners are. He thinks the federal government protects the rich. He thinks it protects industry. He thinks it protects banks. And that they have all gotten rich while the common people have suffered as a result. He wants to reduce the power of the federal government, so he's very much like Jefferson in that regard. He thought the federal government was too large, too powerful, and that the states ought to have more decision-making and more power for themselves. He wanted to do away with Henry Clay's American system. Again, Clay is going to have another guy who's going to try to stop him from implementing his American system. That's one of the reasons why Clay opposed him, right? Because he knew if Jackson gets elected, my American system has no chance of being passed. He believed in a strong president. He thought that the president should be the most powerful person in government. He thought that the executive branch should dominate the other branches. He has a huge personality. He has a large ego, and he plans on using that to support the people that got him there and to punish his enemies and his rivals who had opposed him. He carried a lot of grudges against his enemies and his rivals. In fact, he carried a lot of grudges against the people who had shamed his wife. During the campaign, by the way, his wife died. Some believe the stress caused by the campaign contributed to her death, and he blamed his rivals for her death. He used the veto more than all previous presidents combined. So he believed, hey, forget about Congress making laws. If I disagree with them, I'm going to block them because the people support me. The people voted me overwhelmingly, and so I can basically do what I want to do because the people are going to support me as a common man president. He oftentimes defied the Supreme Court as well. They would make decisions and say, hey, president, now you got to enforce them, and he wouldn't. And you would normally think a president would get in trouble for that. But since he was so popular with the common people, with the masses, they oftentimes supported him in these conflicts. All right? His critics did not. This is an incredibly famous image of him here, known as King Andrew I. This was produced by one of his critics, one of the supporters of the National Republicans. Here you notice he's being depicted as a king, right? And he's trampling all over the Constitution, especially the American system. Basically what they're saying is he's ripping apart and he's defying checks and balances, he's defying separation of power, and he's using that veto stick almost like a king would use his scepter. And he needs to be stopped. He's becoming too powerful, and he's dominating the other two branches, and he's on the verge of threatening or destroying democracy. These were the criticisms of him. He argued, hey, I'm just using my political power to do what the people elected me to do. All right, we're going to stop it there. I'm going to let you do work on your project here for the remainder of class. And then over the weekend, I want you to watch part 2 of this video, which is another, 25 minutes or so as homework. Mr. M signing off, Jacksonian Democracy. Let's keep this train rolling. Have a great weekend, folks. Don't forget to watch the second part of the video.